Well, this is something that does have a specific attachment to the Dead Sea Scrolls, as you know. I'll approach that by asking a simple question that I've never actually heard asked. Daniel chapter 10, and Daniel has, princes, supernatural princes that are duking it out or helping Michael. So there's these supernatural powers called princes, and Michael is one of their chiefs, okay? And then we have opposition. But they're somehow tied to or over or manipulating geopolitical empires that humans run. In the case of the book of Daniel, it's the Babylonians or the Persians, or the Medo-Persians. Has anybody ever asked, hey, where did Daniel get that idea? Because you ostensibly you don't read about it anywhere in the Old Testament. Like, where did he get that? He just woke up one day and this is a great idea. I think I'm going to include it in my book. Like a fiction writer would. No, there's actually an answer to that though. And this takes us to Deuteronomy 32. Now, if you go to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, a lot of the translations that we use, I'm just going to look it up in ESV so I don't misquote it here. A lot of the translations we use will not say anything like this. So this is ESV. When the Most High, again, we know who that is. That's not a brain teaser. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples. So we have to ask ourselves, well, that sounds a little familiar. Like when did that happen? When do we get the nations of the world formed? And the answer to that is Babel. Okay, what happens at the Tower of Babel event? So we're good up to this point. Okay, so when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, Yahweh's portion, is his people. This is verse 9. Jacob is his allotted, that's a key phrase, allotted heritage. A lot of your English translations won't read that he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. They'll say according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, you don't have to be a textual critic, to address this. But if you had the ESV, a study Bible, there's a footnote according to the number of the sons of God. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. It's also what the Septuagint says. Septuagint has angels of God. They're supernatural beings. A lot of King James has according to the number of the sons of Israel and others, but ESV, NLT, NRSV, there are other translations, a handful of them that actually have incorporated the Dead Sea Scroll material in the translation, because this is our oldest and best, material. So that affects what you think is going on here, because you go back in Genesis 11, it's like, well, there's no supernatural beings there in the Tower of Babel story. You're right, but it is here. And if we track through Deuteronomy, this passage, Deuteronomy 32:8, has parallels in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, Yahweh takes Israel as his own, and he forbids the worship of the sun, moon, and stars, who are called Elohim, gods, in Deuteronomy 17. And in Deuteronomy 29, 23 through 26, they're gods that Yahweh has allotted to the other nations, but Israel is his own. What this worldview says, this is the Old Testament explanation for why the other nations have other gods, why the other nations have pantheons, and why Israel is forbidden from worshiping them. Essentially what happens is, I like to refer to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 as the Romans 1 event of the Old Testament, where God, we come out of the flood, God repeats the Edenic mandate. Okay, now, spread over the earth and, do that thing we were supposed to do in Eden before we had the fall and now the flood. But instead of doing that, they don't. They gather, together at a place called, Babel, and they start building a tower. And you say, well, that, maybe they were just bored. It's an innocent thing to do. Well, it's actually not, because everybody agrees, because of the location, Mesopotamia, that the tower is a ziggurat. What's a ziggurat? A ziggurat is a tower that you would build as part of a temple complex. You build it for ritual. You build it for worship of some deity. And you essentially localize the deity to this place. This is exactly the opposite of what God wants done. And so he says, forget it. Forget it. I'm done with you people. Okay, I'm going to allot you to other members of the heavenly host. ostensibly they're to be placeholders. God is still interested in the nations, even though he's like divorcing them now. He's putting them on the shelf. And how do we know that? Because right after Babel, the next thing that happens is God calls Abram and makes a covenant with him and tells him right when he calls him that it's going to be through you and your seed that all these other nations are going to be brought back into relationship with me. So God isn't writing them off permanently, but he's putting them on the shelf, and he assigns them to other beings, other supernatural beings, as if to say, you don't want to follow my orders, you don't want to worship me. Well, there you go. Bye. You know, so long. We're going to do something else. I'm going to start humanity all over again with this dude, Abram, and his wife can't have kids, so she's perfect. Because I'm going to raise up a new humanity, and everybody is going to know that the only reason these people exist is because of my power. That's it. And this becomes the Old Testament, antecedent to basically everything else in the Old Testament, why it's Yahweh against the gods and why it's Israel against the nations. We're not told when, but if you keep reading in Deuteronomy 32, Israel is seduced by some of these other gods to worship them instead of Yahweh. You get to Psalm 82, and these gods are the ones being judged in the divine council. The meeting of the heavenly host where God basically excoriates them for being corrupt and sowing injustice and chaos in the nations. And now he says, I said to you, you're gods, all of you, you're Elohim, all of you, but you're going to die like men. It's an eschatological judgment. This is where Daniel gets his theology, that there's Israel, that's Yahweh's domain, but everything else outside of Israel is under dominion of something else, someone else, that is now in a hostile adversarial relationship against Yahweh and his people. This is the rest of the Old Testament. Frankly, it's the rest of the Bible, because this is where Paul gets his principalities and powers theology from Daniel 10. He uses some of the terminology there in the Septuagint. And he also quotes Deuteronomy 32 when he's talking about demons. He quotes Deuteronomy 32:17, which says Israel, didn't worship God. They worshiped other gods, other Elohim, that are called Shadim in that passage, which unfortunately English translations do translate demons, but it refers to a territorial entity, a territorial spirit, which makes perfect sense in the context of Deuteronomy 32:8. So this is a full-orbed worldview about why other nations worship the gods they do and why Israel is bound to Yahweh and so on and so forth. I mean, you can look this up in my demons book. I have a passage from Plato that actually lays out the Deuteronomy 32 worldview really nicely. It's amazing and wonderful, and it sets up Paul when Paul goes into a Gentile city. He is the apostle to the nations. He's the apostle to the Gentiles. He can go in there and he knows that they share the worldview. He knows that when he preaches Christ, like, they're freaked out, because it's like, you want us to turn away from our gods and to embrace Jesus as, God incarnate and dying for our sins. We can't do that, because the gods we worship now are going to get us. They're going to punish us. And so Paul, could tell them, look, fellows, okay, the Most High became a man. So he's in charge of all these other ones. He's bigger than all these other ones, okay? Became a man, went to the cross, died for you, rose again, and sent me here to tell you that he not only, wants you to come back home, he insists on it. So it just sets up so many other things in terms of a biblical worldview. Paul links the second coming of Jesus to the fullness of the Gentiles. In other words, that point at which God is satisfied with people from these divorced nations coming back to him through Christ, that's going to be a trigger for the reawakening of Israel. This is Romans 11. And that in turn, is going to be, precipitate the day of the Lord, the second coming, and then the end will come. You even get eschatology in here, which factors into spiritual warfare. What's spiritual warfare? It's the Great Commission. Ultimately, that's what it is, because this is the thing they fear. The Great the return of Christ is linked to the Great Commission, and the return of Christ is when the judgment of Psalm 82 gets enacted. They get destroyed. So right now they're fighting for their turf. And what's the game plan? I get asked all the time. Does forces of darkness, do they think they can win? It's like, well, it depends how you define winning. If you define winning as do they think they can kill God? Well, no, that's ridiculous. They know better than that. if you define winning as, all we need to do to stick around here indefinitely is to distract the church and make the church worldly and invalidate its mission and its testimony, and we'll do okay. We'll just prevent the Great Commission from rolling on. It's not hard, simple path. Let's work that plan. And I think they're doing a pretty decent job. I mean, this is from, notice what we just did. We went from Genesis 11 to the eschaton, okay, riding the back of Deuteronomy 32. So this is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. It bleeds out into a bunch of other passages too.
So if I understand that correctly, and I go back into the context of ancient history, so when Nebuchadnezzar wants to build an empire, and he gets this expansionist view of Babylon, what he's actually doing is he's saying, I believe that our Babylon gods are more powerful than the gods of these other nations, and so therefore we're going to prove that by our armies winning. Is that how you would understand that?
That's part of it, but it's actually more sinister. Nebuchadnezzar fancied himself. I'm glad you put it the way you did, when he wants to sort of revive this empire. His Babel, or Babylon, was founded by the Amorites. Okay, like Hammurabi was an Amorite king. This is a direct result of the Amorite migrations sweeping through Mesopotamia in way far back antiquity, and that's significant because of the Amorites just as a people. They are linked to the flood traditions, which takes us back into Genesis 6. They are linked to the people by virtue of flood traditions. They're linked in several ways to the indigenous inhabitants of Canaan when Moses and Joshua get there. Okay, the whole Rephaim thing with from the Nephilim and all this stuff. This is Amorite stuff. Okay, the Amorites have a very deep history in a lot of this, but they're almost unnoticed, by typical Bible readers. Who cares who the Amorites were? So Nebuchadnezzar comes along and he does what Og of Bashan does. He takes the title for himself, Amorite king. Because he wants to link himself with the glory, of the Amorites, and he elevates Marduk, and in his case, which, again, depending on what trajectory you follow with Marduk, can go all the way back, to Nimrod, and all of this weird stuff. So I think Nebuchadnezzar has very grandiose thoughts running through his head, but to the biblical writer, though, the biblical writer is going to see what the biblical writer is going to pick up on these threads and these thoughts, and he's going to see where they all lead. They all essentially lead back to, the pre-flood days, and all this nasty stuff in the conquest, and the sons of God and the Nephilim and all this, which is also a polemic against another Babylonian story, okay, which involves Marduk, the Apkallu story. I mean, there are so many interconnections that are lurking beneath the surface that if you and we and me, if we know the literature of these peoples and their own traditions about themselves, when we read through the Old Testament, and again, this is why we should read this stuff, there are threads there waiting to be picked up by us and understood that otherwise we are completely blind to. So what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is really, it's not just physical warfare, it's spiritual warfare at a very deep level. And a biblical writer and a literate Israelite is going to be picking up on a lot of this stuff. Babylon, this is no secret even to an English Bible reader. You just look up Babylon and trace it through the Bible. Babylon is the chief, historical point and also metaphorical, linchpin thing for chaos. And when you hear chaos, think anti-Eden. Whatever Eden is not, it's what this is. It's Babylon. It even goes into the book of Revelation, Babylon, the great whore, and all this, stuff. And so this is a big deal. The worldview is a big deal, but a lot of the threads that we could pick up, we just can't because we don't see them there.